I'm Corey Costello, and this is Tehachapod's Eye on the Capitol. Eye on the Capitol is an informative look at state and national legislation that impacts your life in Tehachapi. From new proposals, new laws, and even future ballot measures, we do the research and pass on that information to you while you go about your life. On today's episode, we explore a brief guide to the statewide initiatives that will be on the November 2024 ballot. A new state law has some economic repercussions, more details on the impact of the recently approved state budget, the Federal Reserve Chairman testifies on Capitol Hill, and the International Monetary Fund weighs in on economic conditions. We start at the nation's capital, where the race for the presidency went from simple to complicated following the announcement that President Joe Biden is bowing out of the presidential race after securing the presumptive Democratic nomination. However, with the Democratic National Convention still weeks away, he was never officially nominated. So what next? According to several sources, the Democratic National Convention in Chicago in August will be considered an open convention for now. While Biden has secured the delegate votes as a result of the primary elections, those delegates are now free to vote for whomever they choose. Delegates are typically activists or local party officers representing their home state at the convention. They gather in person at the convention and make their vote allocation official during state-by-state roll calls. Some DNC officials have pointed to the possibility of a virtual selection of the nominee before the start of the convention on August 19th, something they had reportedly been considering prior to August 7th to wrap up Biden's formal nomination 2 weeks before the start of the DNC. Following the endorsement by President Biden and several other top Democrats in the nation, including California Governor Gavin Newsom, eyes are on Vice President Kamala Harris as a presumptive frontrunner to secure the nomination. Any campaign funds already raised by the former Biden-Harris ticket will stay in a Harris for President campaign. Questions, however, remain as the deadline is passed in several states to have candidates placed on a ballot. Can the candidate just change? Officially, the Democratic Party never confirmed Joe Biden as the nominee, and therefore several states claim they would allow and have previously allowed for parties that have had late conventions. According to NBC News, there are already established procedures in Democratic Party rules, campaign finance laws, and state code to govern most of the key questions facing Democrats and the country right now. Some of it, however, is untested and could be the subject of lawsuits down the road. Speaking of the election, the presidential race aside, in California, voters will weigh in on a variety of statewide initiatives this November, some of which could shape policy and impact the lives of millions of Californians. While the list of initiatives could have been much higher, several last-minute negotiations in the state capitol led many proponents to remove their measures in favor of legislative or budget considerations, even as the state is dealing with a massive budget deficit. Here's a brief list of initiatives that did make the ballot and their ask of voters. Proposition 2 is a bond measure that would authorize the state to borrow $10 billion to modernize K-12 classrooms and community colleges. The funding could be used to repair outdated school buildings, upgrade libraries, heating and cooling systems, and install broadband internet. Proposition 3 relates to marriage as it seeks to amend the California Constitution and language that still defines marriage as between a man and a woman. While the constitutional clause is unenforceable and same-sex marriage is federally protected, proponents want to replace the language with a broad right to marry to protect against future Supreme Court decisions. Proposition 4 is another bond measure authorizing the borrowing of another $10 billion to help fund the response to climate-related disasters such as flood, drought, and extreme heat. The bond also claims to ensure clean drinking water. If approved, it would be the largest investment in combating climate change in California history. Proposition 5 would make it easier for local governments to approve bonds and tax measures that fund affordable housing, road, transit expansions, parks, wildfire resilience, and other public infrastructure projects by lowering the voter threshold to approve these measures from a 2/3 supermajority to 55%. If Proposition 5 passes, it would affect all future local bond campaigns covered by the measure, including those concurrently on the November ballot. Proposition 6 would ban involuntary servitude and end mandatory work requirements for state prisoners. This proposed constitutional amendment is part of the reparations package for descendants of African Americans enslaved in the United States. Proposition 32 would once again increase California's hourly minimum wage from $16 to $18 and annually adjust it for inflation. The proposal comes after the state's most powerful union secured a $25 an hour minimum wage for healthcare workers and $20 an hour for fast food workers, although the healthcare worker minimum has been delayed due to budget constraints. Proposition 33 would allow cities and counties to enact rent control by repealing a 1995 law called the Contra-Hawkins Rental Housing Act, which generally restricts local government's ability to limit rental rates issued by landlords. Proposition 34 would require healthcare providers to spend most of the revenue they get from federal drug discount programs on direct patient care. However, it would only apply to a very specific subset of providers that have spent more than $100 million over a decade on anything other than direct patient care. Proposition 35 would provide permanent funding for Medi-Cal, California's version of Medicaid, which pays for health insurance plans for low-income residents. Current funding for the program, a tax on measured health insurance plans, is set to expire in 2026. And finally, one of the most discussed propositions is Proposition 36, backed by law enforcement agencies. It would roll back parts of Proposition 47, which a decade ago recategorized some offenses into low-level misdemeanors. Proposition 36 would impose harsher sentences for drug possession and retail theft. It would turn some crimes involving fentanyl and repeated shoplifting offenses that are currently misdemeanors back into felonies. Specifically, any third theft conviction, no matter the value, could lead up to 3 years in prison, and the possession of fentanyl a felony. Finally, the measure would impose a treatment-mandated felony the third time someone is arrested for drug possession. A coalition of supporters has raised over $9 million in support of the measure, including Walmart being the biggest supporter with $2.5 million in contributions. Other top donors include retailers such as Home Depot and Target with $1 million each, and 7-Eleven and associated committees with more than $600,000. Governor Gavin Newsom recently signed legislation barring school districts from requiring that parents be informed of their child's change in sexuality or gender identity without the parent's permission. The legislation, Assembly Bill 1955, overrules school boards with policies in place requiring that schools be transparent with parents about their child's perceived sexual orientation or gender identity, an issue that remains an active subject of debate. California is the first state to adopt such legislation. The governor's press office issued a rebuke to criticism of the bill, claiming it, quote, does not allow a student's name or gender identity to be changed on an official school record without parental consent. It does not limit a student's ability to discuss their gender identity with their own family, does not take away or undermine parents' rights. Parents have a crucial role in discussions about a student's LGBTQ plus identity, and AB 1955 does not prevent families from having those conversations, end quote. California law allows parents to access educational records and gives parents the right to consent to a child's name change. Elon Musk, owner of SpaceX and X, formerly Twitter, has announced he is moving the headquarters of both companies out of the Golden State due to what he perceives as an attack on parental rights in California. Following the approval of the state budget last month, the reality of the spending plan is starting to raise concerns for financial experts. A report by the financial oversight firm Liberty Wealth is shedding additional light on the spending plan, showcasing that initially, Governor Gavin Newsom anticipated a $37.9 billion shortfall for 24-25. However, updated data indicates the deficit could reach $73 billion, while the Legislative Analyst's Office cautioned of a $68 billion shortage. The actual problem exceeds their estimations, created when the state received roughly $24 billion less than anticipated in the previous budget year. While borrowing from other funds was the tone of this year's budget, lawmakers could also seek to raise taxes. However, that still requires a two-thirds majority legislature vote in Sacramento. Lawmakers worry about making taxpayers pay more amidst the economic uncertainties and political limitations. California plans to use its rainy day fund and delay spending to reduce the budget gap. Robert Rivas, the Assembly Speaker, says they may consider steep program cuts, which will mean tough times ahead. Federal funding in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic has also dried up. A recent study showed that income levels are down 4% in California and other places like New York. Labor costs are also a concern for the state that has $40 billion in state worker salaries and pension costs. Not filling many vacant positions was a major part of this latest spending plan, but analysts are not sure if that goes far enough in the long term. Due to some of those practices, the potential for labor union conflicts could arise, leading to additional work stoppages or strikes. Liberty Wealth suggests beyond the current issues, leaders need to prioritize long-term fiscal sustainability, local initiatives, and grassroots effort to strengthen social safety nets and support networks, noting that investing in infrastructure and innovation lays the foundation for success in the long haul. California fire officials are considering implementing a sweeping ban on bushes, brush, or any combustible materials within 5 feet of homes in areas considered high risk for wildfires. Wildfire season started especially early in 2024, and for more than a year now, insurance companies have started refusing to provide coverage to homes or structures in high-risk wildfire areas. State fire officials are hoping to minimize this risk and now working on strict new wildfire prevention regulations that would ban bushes, woody plants, pine needles, or anything flammable from being within 5 feet of homes in wildfire-prone areas. The rules are being formulated by the California State Board of Forestry and Fire Protection, acting on the requirements of a 2020 law called Senate Bill 3074. A similar law is already in effect in South Lake Tahoe, where the 2021 Caldor fire destroyed more than 1,000 structures. The new regulations still only exist in draft form, and there is no time frame for when they'll be approved or when enforcement will begin. There may be a phase-in plan where enforcement will only apply to new homes and then existing homes later. The rules are expected to apply only in areas that CAL FIRE has designated as fire hazard severity zones, and this rule was already supposed to have taken effect, but that board is still working on a draft that's expected to be completed by the end of the year. According to the Fire Hazard Severity Zones map, this regulation will not impact the city of Tehachapi, but could potentially impact those living in certain areas of Golden Hills, Old Town, Bear Valley Springs, Stallion Springs, Mountain Meadows, and Sand Canyon. To check your home, you can access CAL FIRE's Hazard Severity Zones map in the description section of this podcast. Shifting to Capitol Hill and the economy, Fed Chairman Jerome Powell addressed the Senate Banking Committee earlier this month, discussing issues with the economy, specifically the job market, inflation, and how those could impact a potential interest rate reduction later this year. Powell told the senators that inflation is not the only risk we face, but also a cooling job market. The unemployment rate has inched up to 4.1% in June from 3.7% in December. Powell described the job market as roughly back to pre-pandemic conditions when it was strong but not overheated. Meanwhile, inflation fell to 2.6% in May, according to the Fed's preferred gauge, down from 4% a year earlier, but still above the Fed's 2% target. Officials have held back their benchmark interest rate between 5.25% and 5.5%, their highest level in more than 2 decades since last July. While almost all of Powell's commentary suggests it was a matter of when, not if, the Fed would cut rates, he repeatedly spurned efforts by lawmakers to pin him down on the exact timing. The International Monetary Fund, however, released their own data and projections this month, indicating that inflation is not showing many signs of easing globally, which could lead to higher interest rates for longer than expected. The IMF's chief economist Pierre-Olivier Gourinchas says the momentum was slowing on bringing down inflation globally.
In the United States, we see increasing signs of cooling. In the euro area, meanwhile, growth is picking up. Asia's emerging market economies remain the main engine for the global economy. Growth in India and China is revised upwards and accounts for almost half of global growth. Yet prospects for the next 5 years remain weak. Growth in China is projected to moderate to 3.3% by 2029, well below its current pace. As in April, global inflation will slow to 5.9% this year from 6.7% last year, broadly on track for a soft landing. But in some advanced economies, especially the United States, progress on disinflation has slowed. Risks remain broadly balanced, but some downside near-term risks have gained in prominence. First, there could be bumps on the disinflation path in advanced economies. This could force central banks, including the Federal Reserve, to keep borrowing costs higher for even longer. That would put overall growth at risk, with increased upward pressure on the dollar and harmful spillovers to emerging and developing economies. Mounting empirical evidence points to the importance of global headline inflation shocks, mostly energy and food prices, in driving the inflation surge and subsequent decline across a broad range of countries. The good news is that as headline inflation shocks receded, inflation came down without a recession. The bad news is that energy and food price inflation are now almost back to pre-pandemic levels in many countries, while overall inflation is not yet. One reason, as we emphasized previously, is that goods prices remain high relative to services. Unless goods inflation declines further, pressure on services prices and wages may keep overall inflation higher than desired.
The IMF is forecasting U.S. economic growth of 2.6% for 2024, a downward cut of 0.1% and 1.9% for the next year, and an indication of a cooling of the U.S. labor market. The International Financial Institution kept its forecast on global economic growth steady at 3.2% in 2024 and upgraded 2025 by 0.1% to 3.3%. Mailing something just got more expensive as the U.S. Postal Service continues with their Delivering for America 10-year plan for financial stability. Made effective July 14th, new rates include a 5-cent increase in the price of a first-class Mail Forever stamp from 68 cents to 73 cents. That's not all. The stamps fall among other postage price adjustments, raising mailing service product prices approximately 7.8%. Additional price raises include metered 1-ounce letters from 64 cents to 69 cents, domestic postcards from 53 cents to 56 cents, international postcards and 1-ounce international letters both from 155 to 165, and additional ounce pricing for single-piece letters from 24 cents to 28 cents. In 2021, the USPS announced its goals for the next decade on the basis of transforming from an organization in financial and operational crisis to one that is self-sustaining and high-performing. That's the latest from Eye on the Capitol. If you have a question or would like more information about one of the topics covered or have an idea for a future episode, email us at media@TehachapiCityHall.com. Until next time, you keep living up Tehachapi, and we'll keep an eye on the Capitol.